So first, I just wanted to say that the discussion in week 2 was really good, and it appeared from initial responses and comments that there were some aha moments. So nice work, everybody. Good job. So let's get into the PowerPoint. Last week we discussed IDEA. We talked about the 6 pillars or elements, the support structure. This PowerPoint is focused on the first pillar, FAPE, or a free appropriate public education. It sounds like a relatively easy concept, but it's actually one of the more difficult concepts of IDEA. The inclusion of FAPE in the IDEA in 1975 was an important focal piece of the legislation. Congress was addressing the overwhelming number of children, about 1 million children, that were being denied access to an education. Remember that the legislation is a reflection of the intent of Congress, and it's usually very broad. It's not specific. The Federal Register, and we're looking at Federal Regulation 317, Free Appropriate Public Education, or FAPE, which means special education and related services that are provided at public expense, under public supervision and direction, and without charge, that meet the standards of the SEA, or the State Education Agency, including the requirements of this part. Include an appropriate preschool, elementary school, or secondary school education in the state involved, and are provided in conformity with an individualized education program, an IEP, that meets requirements section 300-320 through 300-324 of the federal regulations. So this gives the parameters for providing FAPE. And just a few comments about this regulation. As you read through regulations, you're going to see acronyms. This SEA is going to stand for the State Education Agency. So as far as it goes for us, that's the Michigan Department of Education. And when we're looking at number 4, when it's talked about 300-320 through 300-324, we're going to be looking more in depth at those as the course progresses. So let's look at the term free appropriate public education. So free, first and foremost, students with disabilities must be provided special education and related services at public expense. That means without charge to the child or the child's parents. All specifically designed instruction is provided at no cost. However, any fees that are normally charged to non-disabled students are not covered under this regulation. It means that they have to be paid. So example, athletic fees, if you go out for a sport and you have to pay athletic fees, non-disabled students who are disabled and found to be under IDEA still have to pay those fees. Or a specific lab that might be included with a course. Those are not included in the free appropriate public education. So the next word, appropriate. IDEA mandates that schools individualize each child's education program. Because each child's program differs, Congress did not specifically define appropriate. Since there was not specific language in the statute, the courts have had to take on the burden of determining the intent of Congress when it comes to individual districts' responsibility to providing FAPE. The problem with the term appropriate is that it is subjective. What constitutes an appropriate education for one person might mean a different appropriate for somebody else. What a parent considers appropriate may be entirely different from what the school considers appropriate. The law does not offer a single definitive answer to the question, what constitutes an appropriate education? School districts must provide specific services to meet the particular educational needs of each student with a disability. The IDEA mandates that a continuum of services must be offered. However, a specific plan to follow depending on the student's disability is not provided. The law places the responsibility of determining what is the most appropriate for the child to the IEP team. So public refers to the public school system. Children with disabilities have the right to attend public school just as other children do, regardless of the nature or severity of their disability. The public school system must serve students with disabilities and respond to their individual needs. And education is what the law is all about. IDEA is an education act. It guarantees a free, appropriate public education that consists of special education and related services provided in conformity with an IEP that meets the requirements that are specified within the law, within the regulations, and are based on the child's individual needs. So, once again, keep this in mind because this will be your role as a special educator, or for other students who may be in a different field like a speech therapist or a psychologist. You are also going to have to know the regulations and be able to work through them because you may be part of the IEP team and need to know what is involved. Remember, FAPE is to be provided to all children with disabilities. However, implementation differs for each child. So the federal regulations provide more detail in what must occur to provide a free, appropriate public education. So Regulation 300-101 starts to get into more detail. A free, appropriate public education must be available to all children residing in the state between the ages of 3 and 21. Remember, this is the federal regulation, so whatever state's reading it, that's who it goes to. So all the states are involved in this. Between the ages of 3 and 21 inclusive, including children with disabilities who have been suspended or expelled from school as provided for in 300-530, which we'll be discussing in a later week when we talk about discipline. FAPE for children beginning at age 3. Each state must ensure that the obligation to make FAPE available to each eligible child residing in the state begins no later than the child's 3rd birthday, and an IEP or an IFSP, an individual family service plan, is in effect for the child by that date in accordance with 300-321 Section B. If a child's 3rd birthday occurs during the summer, the child's IEP team shall determine the date when services under the IEP or IFSP will begin. So Section A sets up zero reject policy. That's what it's termed. No child can be denied. Zero reject. Everybody's included. FAPE must be available to all children with disabilities. The regulations set up timeframes for specific things to happen when an individual family service plan or IEP must be in place. Children advancing from grade to grade. Each state must ensure that FAPE is available to any individual child with a disability who needs special education and related services, even though the child has not failed or been retained in a course or grade and is advancing from grade to grade. So even though the child's not failing, if they are still considered a student with a disability, they must be guaranteed a free, appropriate public education. So it's not just to serve students who are failing. The determination that a child described in paragraph A of this section is eligible under this part must be made on an individual basis by the group responsible within the child's LEA or local education association for making eligibility determinations. So that's what is involved. So in week 1, we discussed the different types of laws. One of the things that I talked about was when statute law was challenged. If a case was brought to the courts to decide, then the outcome of that case was case law. Here's an example of that. One of the terms that's used in FAPE is appropriate. The statute lacks guidance regarding appropriate. The term is subjective, and different members of the IEP team may interpret the term differently. They may not agree on what is appropriate for the student. So the IEP team, even though the parent is part of it, the majority of the team may think one piece of one plan is appropriate and the parent may not agree. Many times the parent wants more than is necessary sometimes. And who decides that? Who determines appropriate? So the Raleigh case was one such situation. Amy Raleigh was hearing impaired, and her parents argued that the school was required to provide a full-time sign language interpreter. The school argued that Amy made reasonable academic progress without the assistance of a sign language interpreter, that Amy could read lips and with other accommodations had received a free appropriate public education. The school district used her grades and progress in relation to her peers that the IEP team had reasonably planned for her to receive a free appropriate public education. So what were the findings of that? The Supreme Court determined that a school is not responsible for providing the maximum level of services possible to meet the goals of a child's IEP. The schools do not have to provide the optimum level of services, but rather a basic floor of opportunity and some educational benefit. So the parents wanted a sign language interpreter, which would have been the optimal level of services. The school district showed that their plan made it so that Amy could get benefit from her education and progress. Even though it wasn't the maximum level to have a sign language interpreter and all these other services, she was still getting benefit from her education and progressing along in the general ed curriculum. So prior to this ruling, there were mixed opinions as to whether schools had to maximize student potential when providing services to students with disabilities. But as a result of this case, the Supreme Court provided lower courts with a standard to determine if the FAPE mandate of IDEA has been satisfied, if it's appropriate. The Supreme Court developed this two-part test. The first question, has the school complied with the procedures of IDEA? Did the school district follow the regulations that are related to evaluation and determination of eligibility of a student? So that's the first thing. Have they followed all the procedures to get to the point where they are at? The second question, is the IEP developed through the procedures of the Act? Is it reasonably calculated to enable the child to receive educational benefit? Are they getting something out of their education? Was it developed in accordance with the regulations? Were all the parts there? And we're going to get in depth to those regulations as we move through the class. Was the IEP implemented the way it was written? Is the child making measurable progress? And how do you determine that? Once again, we're going to get more in depth to that. Did the student experience a loss of educational benefit because the school district did not follow procedures? So you have to determine if the school complied with the procedures of IDEA. Was the IEP developed through the procedures of the Act? Was it reasonably calculated to enable the child to receive educational benefit? If so, then FAPE has been met. If not, was there loss of educational benefit? So that's a whole nother piece of it. And we'll talk about that as we talk about monitoring of the school districts. So after the Raleigh decision, other families raised FAPE-related challenges, and the lower courts had to analyze and interpret those challenges and incorporate the Raleigh decision. They had to use that two-part test to help them make a determination. In 1984, U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit interpreted the broad language, some educational benefit. How can districts determine if FAPE is achieved? Is the placement meeting the individual needs of the child? And they have to be able to use multiple criteria like student grades and promotion, progress on IEP goals, standardized test scores. Hopefully the collected information that helped them develop a plan will result in measurable progress for the student. If the parents don't feel that the individual plan being developed is appropriate, the school district has data to support that the student is making progress. Remember, we're going back to that two-part test. So they'd have to look, were the procedures followed, and then did the student make educational benefit? So hopefully if the school district has this data in place, they'll be able to answer that second question a little better. It's important to collect data from the different sources to help determine placement and review whether the student's making progress. So if we're looking at student grades and promotion, grades are commonly used by IEP teams to determine if a child is making reasonable progress in school. While grades and promotion from grade to grade are common indicators of progress, they do not automatically render a child's educational program appropriate. According to the Raleigh decision, each case has to be analyzed individually. So therefore, student grades and grade promotion are subject to scrutiny as measures of progress, but they can still be used as part of it. They can't be the only determination. The focal point of educational progress is embedded in the goals that you write in your IEP. If appropriate, the objectives of the child's IEP. The IDEA requires special ed teachers to track and measure student progress on annual goals and short-term objectives. Making progress or mastering measurable, appropriate goals that are linked to the present level of performance is a common indicator of an appropriate education. But if a student fails to make progress on his or her IEP goals, it does not automatically mean the education program is inappropriate. And if you look at standardized test scores as a piece of it, the IEP team often uses standardized test scores to demonstrate educational progress. For example, during an annual or review, a team may compare the grades, the age equivalents, and standard scores from prior testing and newer testing to see if there was progress. The team will generally interpret improved scores as an indication of educational progress. Using standardized test scores can be problematic, though. The scores are nationally normed and may not accurately measure or assess the student's progress. Teacher-developed curriculum-based measures might provide a more accurate picture of the student's progress in the school's curriculum. So it's important that you use multiple criteria when you're trying to answer the question of whether the placement is meeting the individual needs of this child. Not one of these is the best thing, although progress on IEP goals is probably the best piece to use as a measurement. So in summary, every child eligible for special education services has a right to a free, appropriate public education. Schools should do everything they can to ensure that every eligible child receives a free, appropriate public education. The term appropriate has made it difficult to implement FAPE. The High Court stipulated that the optimal level of services is not necessary or mandated to provide a FAPE. You just have to provide educational benefit. Every student with a disability must be provided a basic floor of opportunity and access and must receive some educational benefit through the IEP. So we've been looking at all of the rules and laws developed up to this point to ensure students with disabilities a right to a free, appropriate public education. So keep in mind why that's necessary as we move through this. Why can't this just happen as a norm? Why do we have to have all these regulations and rules in order to provide a child a free, appropriate public education, which they should get anyway? So just a thought. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch or post them in the virtual office or in the discussion as we're going through that week, because the other students may be wondering the same thing or may provide a good viewpoint in response.